Hey everybody, welcome to Inquire Anomalous. This is our first interview episode, and I'm joined by J Kean and Mitch Horowitz. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Great to
be here. Yeah, we've got a great guest today who we both met in person for the first time when you appeared at our conference last month in New York City alongside Gary Nolan and other great minds. Mitch Horowitz, for those in the audience, is an award-winning historian whose books include Occult America, Daydream Believer, and his most recent, Uncertain Places, Essays on Occult and Outsider Experiences. Among other publications, Mitch has written for the New York Times, Boing Boing, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Time, and Politico. Mitch, it's really great to have you here on the show today.
Likewise, great to be here with you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, it was so great that you were able to join us for that event. It was great to meet you in person, and your work is tremendous. So for people watching and listening to this, you definitely have to check out his books. And again, he just came out with a book, Uncertain Places, which is kind of where I wanted to start, because even in the title, and I love how you open the book up, but when you're talking about uncertain places, why is that important?
Well, it seems to me it's where our culture is today, with the UFO thesis going mainstream. Other possibilities have opened up to us, and even areas that are not necessarily considered mainstream are in flux. For example, those of us who are deeply interested in ancient esoteric spirituality, Hermeticism, the roots of astrology, new texts are being discovered, new texts are being translated. And I suppose I find myself in an uncertain place. When you put together a collection of your writings, you're turning a page. And I'm still not sure what's on that following page once I'm turning it. And I do know that it's so important for all of us, certainly speaking for myself, that our search not get stale. I never want to hear myself repeating the same lines. I never want to hear myself giving a stump speech. And when I do, I know something is wrong because I'm settling into a kind of catechism. So I think for all of us, we're in an uncertain place, and a page is turning culturally. And I really wouldn't have said that several years ago. We may return to this at some point in the interview, but the philosophy of materialism, or the perspective that matter creates itself and everything is just a mechanical process within a box of Newtonian physics, that doesn't work anymore. It no longer covers the basis of life, coming out of the hard sciences, coming out of individual testimony, coming out of cognitive fields, psychology. We live in a perceptual universe to some greater or lesser extent. And materialism is going to remain dominant for a long time because it's very firmly ensconced in our culture, particularly academia, journalism. I would say, frankly, more in the humanities and social sciences than in the hard sciences, certainly. And so we're in an uncertain place, and it's important to be acknowledging of that.
That's great. Yeah, and I appreciate that too, because even with Inquire Anomalous, it's a very similar approach. It's not the end all be all. It's an approach into inquiring into the anomalous and similar. Also, I appreciate how you take on the subject of new thought, and kind of into that is positive thinking. Mm-hmm. And I know you've talked about it before, but like, say, The Secret and kind of like the law of attraction idea. But I like the approach that you bring to it, and I really vibe with it. And something that I think has been intuitive in my own journey is that it's not everything that glitters is gold. You're not just going to manifest a heavenly realm right here, and you bring a kind of realistic and practical kind of perspective on new thought. So can you explain that a little?
Sure. I'm glad you brought up The Secret. Actually, I have a complexity of feelings about The Secret. A lot of people within the alternative spiritual culture, the New Age culture, not to mention just the mainstream culture in general, always kick off conversations with me by telling me how much they loathe The Secret, as if that in and of itself is some mark of seriousness. it's important to remember The Secret came out 2006. It's been a long time, and it's time that people stopped using The Secret as this all-purpose punching bag, you know. And I very frequently notice that within the alternative spiritual realms that I travel in, hating on The Secret is considered to be a badge of intellectual seriousness. And I have very deep problems with The Secret. I've written critically about it. I've written critically about Rhonda Byrne's point of view, which I don't share because I don't use the term law of attraction because it connotes our living under one mental super law, and I think that's inadequate to describing the conditions under which we live. We experience many, many different laws of forces. It may be that consciousness is the ultimate arbiter of reality, and I do believe that myself. At the same time, there are vastly intervening forces, as there are, if there is a law of mental causation, I don't see why it would be exceptional among natural laws. Water is always H2O, but it can be liquid, vapor, solid, depending on surrounding conditions. Gravity is constant, but obviously it's radically different depending on the presence of mass and so forth. And so the individual is going to encounter a dynamic of laws and forces, including overwhelming countervailing forces sometimes, which doesn't mean that we shut down the inquiry, because I think the inquiry is really valid and sound and important. I have to take my hat off to Rhonda Byrne in certain ways. When that movie came out, no one expected it to become anywhere near the epic cultural presence that it did. She had a vision, she saw through her vision, she succeeded. And I do believe that The Secret as a book, as a movie, helped open up millions of people to consider the possibilities of their minds. I have never, literally, and I've been doing this a long time, I've never encountered anyone who has spent ruinous sums of money or done something self-destructive based on having viewed The Secret and run out and max out their credit cards. You know, I'm always hearing people say they don't like The Secret because they disdain its values. And everybody always invariably references this idea that manifesting a Mercedes-Benz shouldn't be the end point of the search. There's no Mercedes-Benz in the movie. You know, there's no, you know, that's actually not in the movie. And several years ago, feeling the need to revisit it, I rewatched it with one of my kids. And the fact is, I liked the values in the movie. I thought the movie presents some very good values. My point of difference, and it's a very, very sharp one, is what I was just referencing to. I don't think that promulgating the idea that life is subject to one mental super law covers the basis of what people experience. I've very frequently criticized New Thought as a spiritual movement for failing to arrive at a theology of suffering, for failing to address people's lives in all their difficulties, other than to just say, well, try again, you're not doing it right, which is insufficient. Or borrowing ideas from other philosophies like karma, which is a huge idea, not something just to be cherry-picked to plug up a hole in my own boat. You know, if you believe in karma, then that in and of itself is a vast journey into ancient Vedic religious ideas. And karma is a very vast idea, sometimes with very impersonal implications. It's not exactly instant karma, the way John Lennon sang, although we'd like to feel that way, and for good reason. And sometimes maybe it is, sometimes maybe it is, but it's a vast concept. And so The Secret did a wonderful job of cracking open the door to a new generation of people thinking about different causative potentials of thought. And that's been a good thing overall. People have a field day with The Secret. Oh my God, there was a writer in the Atlantic Monthly years ago who blamed The Secret for the cause of the 2008 financial crash, the mortgage crisis, blamed The Secret for the irrational exuberance that had gripped the culture. And that's preposterous. You know, I mean, you can cite certain deregulatory efforts that began under the Clinton administration. You can cite predatory lending practices. You can cite inflations and housing bubbles, which both government agencies and private banks contributed to. And there's a whole complexity of factors there. I don't think that metaphysical movie that came out 18 months earlier caused our financial crash. And so the secret polarizes, the secret really polarizes. And I think it's worth stepping back from that. One could be very critical of it, as I am. And I've been very explicitly critical in my book, One Simple Idea, and other places. But we also need to give it a rest as a culture sometimes with hating on the secret. By the way, apparently hundreds of millions of people cumulatively have seen the movie or read the book. So somebody presumably must have liked it. So all the people I know on the new age who are telling me that they hate The Secret, well, someone among them must secretly harbor a affection for it, because it certainly proved enormously popular. But anyway, this is just to say, I think we need to bring a complexity of attitudes to what that was as a cultural phenomenon. And I'm glad it got interjected into the culture, because it helped abet conversations like this one, I think.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. And talking about moving past materialist thinking and potential mental super laws, causative potentials of thought as we are, people are often confused by the behavior and appearance of non-human intelligence. When we face what's often termed non-human intelligence, anomalous beings in person, via telepathic means, any of these forms, it often seems that they're relating to us by accessing kind of like our hard drives rather than the desktop interface. People often report deeply resonant symbolic imagery, their greatest fears appearing almost as a holographic projection, the possibility of a being masquerading and perhaps attempting an exchange in the form of a mirror to the viewer. What do you think of that notion? And can you envision ways of retaining agency and balance in situations such as those?
Well, it's a fascinating question, because the experiences that you have been describing have been reported across history, including obviously contemporary to this conversation, by vast numbers of people from vastly different walks of life, backgrounds, economic strata, educational levels, professional status, and so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why this question is so hot in our culture today, because the testimony in and of itself provides extraordinary evidence. One of the impoverishments that philosophical materialism has brought to our culture is this notion that what they refer to as anecdote is irrelevant. And this debate has been raging in Western science since the Victorian era. What do you do with anecdote? And of course, what the materialist approach does with anecdote is classify it as exactly that. Anecdote sounds like something that's disposable, that's subjective, that's based on just varieties of personality. It's suggestive of a disorder or psychosis or something of that nature. Anecdote as a term is intended to marginalize the witness. I use the term testimony, and testimony is something that I think culturally we would all agree is to be taken seriously. Testimony is what we rely upon in the legal system. Testimony is something we rely upon in medicine a great deal, both physically and therapeutically. In fact, anybody who takes an SSRI or an SNRI, as I do, can recollect any number of discussions with a therapist who asks, how are you doing? Are you responding well to this? Do we need to adjust it? What have you? We don't have a firm grasp on how these things work precisely. It's very dependent upon testimony, and testimony over time, of course, becomes a record. Why is that any less of a record in matters of phenomena than it is in matters of policy, legality, or medicine? So we're still having a debate that raged in the era of William James, my intellectual hero. And James, the American philosopher and psychologist, was adamant that American science, American medicine had to make room for testimony, and in fact already did. It's only when testimony travels in areas that pertain to phenomena or pertain to things that are not necessarily part of common observation that it gets kind of red tagged as anecdote. So we have vast amounts of testimony, and we also have empirical evidence. There are all kinds of so-called close encounters of, I would say, the first, second, and third kind, where we have physical evidence, visual evidence, things of that nature. And this question is only building, because with the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, I suppose it gives approbation for more people in media and in just ordinary walks of life to talk about these things more freely. And so it seems to me it's a breakthrough on several levels, not only in terms of validating phenomena, but in terms of validating testimony. And this is going to a place, this conversation that we're having culturally is going to a place that we don't know the end point of, but it is absolutely converging with data that has come out of the hard sciences, quantum mechanics in particular, but not just that. We have all kinds of data within our framework that has proven replicable, that has proven factual, that has on either a statistical or visual level. For example, what might be called the mirroring effect of objects, either on the particle level or on the cosmic level, causing changes in one another at vast distances with no evident connection. I'm not even touching upon the vastness of data that we've gathered over the past 80, 90 years out of quantum mechanics that shows particles and objects larger than particles behaving in deterministic ways that violate standard Newtonian physics, and that are real, demonstrable, replicable, and yet we don't know the cause. We don't know the cause, which has, I think, sharpened our focus on the question of effects emanating from other intersections of time or other dimensions. And we as a culture are starting to get more comfortable with these concepts. It used to be that if you talked about another dimension, it sounded very far out and very science fictive. And the fact is, people in the hard sciences who are studying quantum mechanics reference these topics all the time. We know space-time bends, we know the infinitude of objects and events that are observed in quantum mechanics, almost as a logical necessity, lead us to the reality and the actual effects of other dimensions, other intersections of time, and so forth. So we're starting to create models for these things: cosmic wormholes, string theory. The people who just won the Nobel Prize in Physics won it for Bell's theorem, which allows us, to put it colloquially, to measure this mirror effect among objects at vast distances. So in a certain sense, that's part of the same conversation, because once you can measure effect, you have to ask yourself, well, what's the cause? What's the cause? So questions of cause have led us to questions of interdimensionality, led us to questions of the possibility of our commonly experienced reality experiencing effects from other intersections of time, which is basically part of the same conversation that you were just referencing. If there are material effects eminent from other dimensions or other time intersections, then it begs the question of the effects of entities, intelligences, beings dwelling as we dwell in an intersection of time, and sometimes crisscrossing with our own. That's part of the conversation about UFO phenomena or so-called ET phenomena or what have you. And it's exciting. It's exciting. These are all just concepts of reality. We don't know what's going on. We use metaphors all the time. I will use metaphors all the time. I might say energies or vibration, and because I'm trying to find a way of generalizing so that we can have a conversation. We use UFO, we use other ET, UAP and so forth. These are just metaphors because we're trying to settle on consensus terms so we can start to talk about what's going on. But it absolutely opens us up to the question, the very live and real question of whether we're experiencing entities, intelligences, beings from other dimensions, other intersections of time, of space-time.
Yeah, and actually getting into that and language and kind of using words to communicate general ideas, and some people taking them literally, which, I mean, again, it's kind of a gray area on if you should take it literally or not, because
No
we
pun
try
intended.
right,
Yeah.
it's like we're trying to define things and create a map of the terrain so we can have some relative understanding. And getting to that, in a recent interview, I heard you mention demons, right? And that's relative to the UFO issue as well, and anomalous experiences, because some people have called UFOs demonic forces.
Mhm.
And there was even a group within the Defense Department called the Collins Elite, which is an informal name. It's not their actual name, but they were looking into the subject, and they tried to shut it down, further study of it while studying in secret, because they believed that if they let disclosure happen, that we would be inviting demons into our realm, basically. So, and again, we're using the word demon, but what actually is a demon? What is the historical context, and why is there a stigma to it, right?
This is such an incredibly important point that you've raised and framed. This is, for me personally, the most critical part of my search today, which is not limiting ourselves to a very narrow corridor of thought because of conceptual definitions that have been handed down to us. And these conceptual definitions, as you were just alluding, have policy implications. If an individual accepts the definition of demon that we as a Western culture have consensually settled upon, then it starts to interject religious attitudes into policy discussions, questions of disclosure that can be very disruptive and that can create a tremendous tunnel vision in terms of how we address questions of observation and phenomena. Now, the term demon emerges from ancient Greek. And as it was used in ancient Greek, it was a moral neutral. It just meant a non-physical entity, or what we might call a spirit or something of that nature. There was not a value judgment attached to it. Clearly, ancient Hellenic culture, like all ancient cultures, and I would say like our own, predominantly believed in the extraphysical, and philosophers and writers and religious figures and scientists referred freely to the extraphysical, and demon was a term that was used, again, in a neutral fashion. Later, in late biblical antiquity and post-biblical antiquity and early modernity, or the early medieval period, the term demon increasingly got used to make reference to a malevolent presence and got associated with the devil, or a very insufficient term that itself is a Dutch and later Middle English term that was frequently invoked in early witch trials and such, and entered the vernacular very commonly and popularly. But the term demon again got remade in late biblical antiquity and post-biblical antiquity especially, as a term that specifically demarcated a dangerous, evil, violent, maleficent force associated with what also became conventionally referred to as the satanic and so forth. And hence, when that term gets used today, it's a conversation stopper. We all know what it means, we all don't like it, and so forth. And complicating the factor, including within the alternative spiritual culture, is that during the Renaissance, when the term occult came into usage, which comes from the Latin occultus, just meaning hidden or unseen, a lot of grimoires or magical tracts were written at that time from within a Christian framework. And some of those writers also began to use the word demon in its consensus way. And that's not anybody's fault so much as if you're living in Renaissance Europe and you're probing ancient or occult or pre-Christian spirituality, it's inevitable that you're going to start using early modern terms that are familiar, that are consensus-based, that are conventional. And so even within magical tradition, even within occult tradition, this stuff gets handed down in a way that's so overwhelmingly familiar, it just seems innately true. And this happens all the time. This is the overwhelming power of language. It comes to seem true by dint of repetition. And as I often say, familiarity is not truth. And it doesn't matter how overwhelmingly familiar something is, it's not truth. And so those terms, at least for me, always need to get used with an asterisk next to them. And I've done the same thing. I mean, if you turn back the pages to my earlier work, like my book, Occult America, that was my first book that came out in 2009. I probably used some of these terms myself just because I was speaking colloquially and the issue just hadn't come up for me. It wasn't a hot issue. But more recently, I've begun to try to peel back the onion on some of these terms, not because I want to add an additional layer of language policing to our culture, which is one of the last things that we need, but because I want us to try to understand the limits on the search that get imposed by some of these handed down meanings and the consequences of some of these limits, not only intellectually, but as you were just referencing, in matters of policy. So if we have a mental picture as Westerners of what demons are, and somebody decides really just as a subjective matter, just because it's familiar in terms of his or her cultural or religious coordinates, that, oh, these reports or this evidence reminds me of something that I don't like, that emanates from my religious tradition, which seems eternal, even though it's made by human hands, and it's not eternal. You know, in fact, religions morph over time, and many of our ideas of what's eternal are a few hundred years old. And yet that familiarity and those cultural coordinates are so familiar that if a person detects almost Rorschach-like within the evidence or within the testimony something that reminds them of something else, boom, we have an effort, as you were describing, to curb disclosure. And to some degree, that's based on our absolute acceptance of language and conditioned ideas, which we embrace frequently as innate truth, just because of overwhelming repetition. So I'm trying to break some of that up, to ask some questions, to part the curtain on some of that.
Yeah, and just kind of like a last comment on that is the funny thing about it is, you know, if you actually had, if somebody sees a word like demon, they assume they know what it means almost subconsciously. They don't
Yes.
even stop and wonder and inquire, wait, what is an actual demon? I do that with words, even simple words, all the time. Wait, what does that really mean? You know, again, with the Zen mind, beginner's mind, the approach of inquiry. And because some of the words, they could be pointing to a real phenomena, but what the baggage of the language might not be accurate, but the phenomena itself may be.
Yes. And when we classify phenomena, again, we need to classify things to the degree that we all need to be able to generalize to a certain extent so that we can communicate with one another. But we have to be very careful. The philosopher P. Deuce Pensky made the observation that when analysis begins, observation ends. And it's helpful to live with that. Obviously, analysis is necessary, but it's not precisely the same thing as observation. And we just have to watch for these mental habits, because we classify things all the time. Again, sometimes by necessity, just to communicate and get through the day. But when we classify something that's unintelligible, we really can enter a very narrow corridor. Obviously, some classifications are necessary. Some classifications are necessary for our physical safety. Touch the stove and you're going to get burned. That's not unintelligible. But things that are unintelligible, that are the subject of very intense questioning, those inquiries get shut down by classification very quickly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it reminds me of situations like syncretic terms and things like that, or the situations that we found ourselves in looking at, and the power that can be found in reminding ourselves that Mercury wasn't quite Hermes, or situations like that, and
right,
and that boundary area, there's real power, and there's real knowledge to be gained by that boundary area between those two figures, and recognizing the distinctions therein, you know.
yeah,
People often comment about that in our community, that we go a lot further if we could agree to common terms, like before when you were talking about vibration and dimensions and how confusing those can be in the history of, you know, New Age thought and things like that. And at the same time, as a historian, you've shown the necessity for us to learn more about where these ideas have come from and being able to rediscover these old terms. So
yeah. If I may, you know, I was just I was speaking at a conference in London on ESP research, and some of the participants were very earnestly considering whether we need to dispense with terms like ESP or parapsychology because they have so much baggage attached to them, and maybe use a term like noetics or something. And that's not exactly my approach, because first of all, people will throw the same rocks at you regardless of what terms you use. You know, ESP became psi, and now psi is becoming maybe something else, and the same rocks get thrown. Better, I think, to do forensics on the term and say, hey, look, this is where it started, this was the intention, and when I use it, that's how I use it. Like New Age, for example, that gets used as an epithet all the time. It's supposed to be everything that's fuzzy and fickle and unserious in spirituality. But I apply the term New Age to myself, and I use it very freely, because to me, I use it in its original iteration. And the original understanding of it as it got popularized in the 70s, at least in my definition, is a radically ecumenical culture of therapeutic spirituality. And it's that simple. It's not for everybody. Some people like the traditions, although I would say the traditions have been remade and cherry-picked a lot more than we sometimes recognize. But regardless, it's not a sign-up sheet for everybody. It's not to everybody's taste, and I dig that. but I'd rather reclaim than shuffle, so that we at least are in the business of understanding where our terms come from and being clear.
It makes a lot of sense. Now, in talking about therapeutic spirituality and reclaiming things, as you were, you, John Mack, and others have often mentioned how anomalous experiencers go through a process from trauma and through transformation. However, you have become very drawn to finding power, a challenging term for many on the other side there. That power can take the form of growth, agency, many things. How important do you find the role of self-empowerment for the anomalous experiencer?
I think it's critical. I think a lot of the low-grade neuroses, depression, anxiety that people go through life with is very frequently a byproduct of a very limited or abrogated sense of power, sense of self-expression. I think so many of us have the experience of marching through life with a sense of ennui, uncertainty, not uncertainty of the good kind, but uncertainty in terms of feeling uncomfortable in our own skin. Frankly, feeling put down frequently by other people, feeling disrespected. And it creates a lot of anger. It creates a lot of substance abuse. It creates a lot of frittering away of time in escapism, kind of getting wasted while you're playing a video game or watching television or what have you. No aspersion on any of those things. We need some of that stuff to relax and to unwind. But when it becomes dominant in a person's life, after punching the clock, after leaving work, the television and the chips and the beer and the weed and so forth becomes a constant routine. It can become very dulling and create a desperation that seeks to anesthetize itself by just returning to the bottle and so forth. So I think a lot of the sorrow that people feel emerges from a lack of a sense of power, a lack of a sense of being seen, which is so important, and a lack of a sense of self-expression, broadly defined, whatever it is a person wants to do in life. And I think those things result in so much terrible, terrible suffering that we anesthetize in different ways, sometimes through outbursts of anger, sometimes through engaging in activities that are destructive, like mad, debt spending, or again, substance abuse. So I think it's critically important. And I was saying last night, I was introducing a screening of Communion at the Watch the Skies Film Festival at the Film Anthology Archives here in New York, which was terrific. And I made the observation there that when witnesses step forward and they're ridiculed or they're unseen, it's probably more jarring in some regards than the initial experience itself, because I think almost nothing in life is more emotionally painful than feeling unseen. And we have to be really careful about that with one another, because we inflict it on one another all the time, and it's cyclical, and it goes two ways.
Yeah, for sure. And something you touched on there a bit is skepticism. And in Uncertain Places, you actually wrote a chapter on James Randi.
Yeah.
And you did give a talk, and you were talking about like the quality of skepticism these days. So within this current conversation, and if I can even say like a cultural movement into an opening of these subjects with UFO disclosure and the entering of those ideas into the mainstream in a serious way, how do you view modern day skepticism?
It has lost itself completely. It has lost itself in a kind of polemical crouch where it's not skepticism at all. It's really just rejectionism. And it is a camp, a polemical camp of opinion that has ceased to be skeptical. If we had a professional skeptic with us in this conversation right now, the overwhelming likelihood is that he or she would just be saying, you guys, don't you understand confirmation bias? Don't you understand, this and that and the other neurological or cognitive developments that all the social scientists have tracked? And when you see a UFO, it's this, and when you do that, it's this, and Horowitz, he's another problem. And they'd have all these diagnostic codes at the ready to describe experience. And think how terribly that would denude the human search to understand. If all observation was nothing more than the cognitive process of picking an answer on a forced choice survey, in a lab, there'd be no Lao Tzu, there'd be no Christ, there'd be no Buddha, there'd be no Proust, there'd be no Sylvia Plath. The whole human inquiry would be boiled down to a kind of linoleum-tiled white coat lab atmosphere where we are all just beings who have within us a very limited range of cognitive choices that are conditioned by other things. And that's the whole human search, wrapped up into a neat package and delivered as a TED Talk, which is often the case in our intellectual culture. And skepticism as it exists today as a professional field is the most extremist fringe of that aspect of our culture. And there's, I would say, rejectionism almost to the point of irrationality. No wish to inquire about anything. And I often look for the use of the term most, when people say, well, most of it, most of this, and it's like, all right. And what comes outside the most? We're talking 5%. 5% can be a really, really big number, depending upon the sample that you're drawing from. Let's start digging there then. Let's grant the point. Okay, most, maybe. But let's start digging there. Let's start digging there. A friend of mine has an expression, something only has to be a little bit true in order to change everything. One should be very venerating of that expression. And the skeptics are incapable of questioning anything. Their job, as they have framed it themselves, really, is a defense of philosophical materialism, and anything that goes outside of philosophical materialism is immediately woo-woo nonsense, which paints them into a very narrow corner, because the fact is, some of the most far-out articles I read today are in Scientific American, much more far out in some cases than what the three of us are talking about right now. And I think there's a point in my book, Daydream Believer, where I quote an article from Scientific American, and not a particularly unusual or exceptional article, but just an article talking about, very good piece, talking about the manner in which perception shapes localization, or perception shapes reality on the quantum scale. And this holds true whether it's a sentient observer or whether it's an automatized device like a photometer or something. It's a very good article. And I footnoted it and I said, I encourage intrepid readers to read this piece and others associated with it and see if my descriptions of what's going on in quantum mechanics are not in fact conservative. My descriptions are conservative, compared to what's really going on among professional discussion within the field. So the skeptics have boxed themselves into a terrible corner. I can be wrong and still get up tomorrow, dust myself off, and continue my search. But many of these guys have created a situation where they've allowed themselves no flexibility whatsoever to be wrong, no flexibility to say, yeah, you're right. Those Gansfeld experiments in ESP, that's really interesting. Well, yeah, you're right. Some of those videos, boy, they really do raise some questions. And when you've eliminated that process from your intellectual geography, listen, you've almost become a fundamentalist, and you've left yourself no room whatsoever for self-reform or to be incorrect. And that's why they argue so vociferously and so emotionally. They're in a terrible spot. I also must say, they've been very successful. because their point of view, and this is somewhat related to the discussion we were just having about conditioned language, has become so familiar within media, within academia, that it's embraced and it's accepted as a given, and there's no proportionality. Steven Pinker, the cognitive psychologist at Harvard, has a recent book out. I believe it's called Rationality, and if I'm remembering the title correctly. And Pinker, at certain junctures in the book, lumps all kinds of points of view together that he describes as irrational. AIDS denial, conspiracy theory, astrology, UFOs, and it's like, wait a minute. Where's your sense of proportionality? These things are wildly different. Conspiracy theory can affect, for the negative, the outcome of democratic elections. AIDS denial has a direct effect on the health of human beings. These are profoundly serious questions. You're telling me that an ancient religious retention of astrology or study into extracognition or study into UFOs is just, prima facie lumped with this stuff? It's just not good thinking. It's not good thinking, but it's a result of the manner in which professional skepticism has been successful as a media phenomena, as a academic point of view. And so it's going to stick around for a long time, maybe a generation, but intellectually, it has petered out. It has waned, and it's exciting because we face the question of what comes next.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny too, because almost in like the debunking or what we could call modern skepticism, which is again not as proficient as it should be, which to be a skeptic is to question, which is not what's going on. But it's almost as if they're assuming the intellectual high ground by denying something and trying to undermine it in a sense.
Yes. And it's a very one-note argument. It's a very one-note argument that also covers a great deal of ground. You know best what you do most frequently. And to get a handle on such a diversity of fields only with the intent purpose of rejectionism spreads a person very thin intellectually.
Along those lines, a lot of people in our community find themselves with the question of dealing with trolls and bad faith skeptics on places like Twitter and various message boards. You've spoken about this often, as you just were, and at our most recent conference. What advice would you give those in ufology or the larger paranormal communities that are just out there online with their Twitter handle or whatever, and choosing to deal or not deal with these trolls that approach us with these types of conversations?
That's a great question, because look, the fact is, social media is where we live. It may be two-dimensional, intellectually and otherwise, but it's where we live. We're having this conversation on Zoom right now. It's going to get posted on YouTube. The three of us have been in the same room together. We're going to be in the same room together on December 3rd for the next Anomalous Experience conference, which I look forward to. But we all who know each other have probably spent more time on social media having conversations like this one than we have in the same room. How much more so is an individual, who's just out there on Twitter looking something up or just keeping track of his or her day, getting hit with mud a lot when these discussions arise. I would say the following, and I feel this very, very strongly, and I'm going to be talking about this a lot more in the near future, because it took me a long time to learn it. You have to set high standards for who you debate with. By all means, debate, but set high standards and don't engage in trash talk. The worst debate device, the worst debate tactic that has become so common within our culture is to shoot the messenger, smear the messenger. So there's a witness, call him a nut, and you're not dealing with the evidence. You're not dealing with anything that's being said. You're not dealing with how it compares to this, that, the other thing. just engage in an ad hominem attack. And of course, this has run riot on Twitter. I mean, it's probably why Twitter has grown as large as it has. It has, as I understand it, 240 million users. I mean, it's the size of a large nation. And all the more reason why the individual must set high standards in terms of debate. And it's hard. And it took me many, many years to learn it, or to at least to apply it, because when it's emotional, it's all emotional. When we feel insulted, we want to strike back. It's a self-defensive thing. And emotions run riot. They run faster than thought. And there's an immediacy to the whole thing. It all starts to happen very quickly. And usually the victor is whomever has more free time on his or her hands, because who could sit on these threads for just hours and hours and hours? You know, in the past, you know, maybe I would have gotten involved with one of these things, exited. I wake up and, you know, hours later, there's some guy who's back, and I'm saying, don't you have to pay the rent? You know, don't you have somewhere to go? Don't you have to drive your kids to school at some point? I mean, there must be something in life that you need to do. Water your plants. And I'm astonished at the amount of time that people waste on these things. So I want there to be debate, but this debate has to occur according to high standards. And I would say to any individual in the seeking community, your search will benefit, and your outlook on life will benefit, and you will feel much more relaxed in the profoundest way if you just desist from any kind of trash talking debates. It's worthless. It's a wasteland. It doesn't persuade anyone. We fail to desist because we're afraid that we're gonna look like the loser, or we're gonna look like, oh, I just got insulted, I'm not responding, so I must be conceding the point. Nobody has that perception. Nobody has that perception. They look at you as a more serious, more substantive, more a person possessed of gravitas if you're not participating in that stuff, because everyone is. It's the herd mentality taken to an extreme. And set really high standards for who you debate with, and do not compromise.
Yeah, and I think you know, in the UFO community or fields, or anomalous experience and studies fields, paranormal, and all fields really, I think you know, we have to really create the environment that we want to work in, right? That we want to come to and enjoy, you know, doing the research and talking about it, and not it being a place where, like, you know, you're gonna, when you come here to talk about it, you're gonna get slammed or undermined, or, you know, what
Right.
have you.
Right.
So I think it's important to create that kind of community and ethic within, you know, the community, so it's a place where, you know, people can talk about these things. They can share ideas, brainstorm, work on projects together. So I think that's incredibly important. And I have a question, kind of like really out of left field, but you're the guy, you know, you're the Manly P. Hall guy. So, and you know, I didn't even know that was your edition of the Secret Teachings of All Ages. I've had that book for, you know, I can't believe it, you know, years.
That was one of the pleasures of my career in publishing the reader's edition, publishing that in 2003. Yeah. Oh, I worked so hard on that, man.
Yeah, and it's an incredible book, and that was my first introduction to Manly P. Hall. And again, this kind of a sweeping question, so you know, do your best to narrow down on it in your own perspective. Is, you know, what is the importance of Manly P. Hall's work in regards to people that are having and studying anomalous experiences or encounters with the phenomenon?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Manly's work, and particularly The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which was published in 1928, when he was all of 27 years old, a story that will never cease to amaze people, no matter how many times it's told. Anybody who's had an experience with that book, either in its original form, which I recommend, or in the reader's edition, which is unabridged in terms of text, although the illustrations are abridged, and I encourage people to explore both. Anybody who's had an experience with Manly's work will always be astonished at the young age at which he produced that book. Again, no matter how many times one repeats it, it never gets old. And that book is such an important and extraordinary entry point for anybody who sees him or herself as part of a search, either a personal or ethical search, or a search as it pertains to phenomena, or as it pertains to extraphysicality, or all three. Part of that book's extraordinary power is that it's so vast and it covers so much subject matter that you almost inevitably discover something about yourself when you enter it. And I had that experience myself. I think when I first entered the book, I think within Manly's own character, there was a voice, there was a impeccability, there was a prodigiousness. And I thought to myself, I aspire to try to arrive at my own best effort at doing this. And there was something about the man that I knew I wanted to emulate best I could in my own fashion, in my own way. It's an aspiration. And for other people, they may read it and suddenly say to themselves, wow, all these alchemical images and everything are speaking to me. Or, frankly, his chapters on cryptozoology may speak to people. There's a point in the book, this was one of my favorite aspects of assembling the reader's edition. He's got a drawing, it's probably Victorian era, of gnomes, and he labels it conventional gnomes, not the remarkable kind, just the every day, and when you realize, though, for example, how different cultures across vast stretches of time, geography, language, custom, have remarkably extraordinary stories of anomalous beings, whether it's what we might call gnomes, what somebody else might call fairies or leprechaun or Aleutians or something else. Every culture has a word for these little beings that have populated human documentation for millennia, literally, and in parable, myth, story, drawing, religion, so forth. And when you start to trace those things across this arc of history, as Manly helps you to do, you might discover a passion that you didn't know was there, or you might have a passion for a topic and suddenly it's supercharged, or you're going to make connections that surprise you. So I like to say, people find themselves within that book. Its vastness is such that it either taps passions or it builds existing passions that we didn't know were there. I don't think there's anybody in the search who shouldn't have his or her hands around a copy of that book. And it's so proliferated now that it's available in one form or another to everybody, in terms of price, in terms of format. It's out there in the culture. And that's really wonderful. And when Manly died in 1990, there was an agony in the man. He really was worried that his work might die with him. He had self-published most of his stuff, in fact, all of his stuff. And he was worried that the campus that he founded and the books that he wrote and so forth would just wind up as museum pieces, and that was that. But vastly more people have read Manly Hall during the past several years at Venture than did during his lifetime. And so it's been a remarkable story on so many levels.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're getting towards the end of our time here today. I've got a wrap up question. I don't know if you do as well, James. I think what I would finish my line of questioning with, I think we both know, at various points in the past have run past Stuart Davis, who sometimes likes to talk about what he calls the genealogy of the strange, the mapping of our family histories, our ancestors, our cousins, descendants, involved in these longstanding mysteries of the anomalous encounters, ESP, and all the rest. In Occult America, you really map out a localized geography of the strange and present kind of a traveling westward expansion of occult ideas. When you look back and trace the spread of occult and paranormal knowledge, what do you think even a well-versed seeker such as yourself would find most surprising about the spread of ideas?
I would say the most surprising thing about the spread of ideas is sometimes, and I was alluding to this in my previous response to James, the parallel insights that occur across stretches of time, language, geography, custom, culture that ought to have nothing in common at all. And yet you will find these vastly different cultures expressing similar ideas with no evident connection. And when you start to discover that, I think there might appear the scent trail of a kind of universal truth. So, for example, within ancient Hermetic spirituality, which was sort of an amalgam of late ancient Greek Egyptian thought, but like all philosophy, invariably didn't just fall out of a tree one day, but had roots that extended much deeper than the dating of the texts themselves. You encounter the idea of all of creation emanating from one universal mind, which the Greeks called nous. And Hermetic literature for a long time was neglected. It was considered discredited because of controversies over the dating, and it wasn't widely translated. In fact, I would say in our own era, we have been fortunate enough to come into circulation of some of the first really quality English translations of Hermetic literature that have ever existed. And yet you'll find other movements, modern movements, including New Thought, it must be said, and others besides, where this idea of a universal mind or an infinite mind, Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul, sometimes the term cosmic consciousness or infinite mind is used, depending. Modernist expressions echoed this Hermetic insight. Quantum theorists, quantum physicists, in fact, I would say really the founders of quantum mechanics, all of whom were philosophical idealists. In other words, they believed in a perceptual basis to reality. They would echo these insights without having availed themselves of Hermetic literature, without necessarily even having had access in the early 20th century to really quality translations of Hermetic literature, depending on what language they were speaking. And they would echo insights that were extraordinarily parallel to some of the things that the ancients were thinking, without there having been a direct lineage or forensics or family tree of ideas. Ideas really go underground in a hard way sometimes. I mean, part of the reason the term occult, meaning hidden, came into use in the Renaissance was because during the centuries of the medieval period, I mean, there were certainly references to ancient spirituality, of course, Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, and so forth. But all the source material, the temple orders, had been subject to destruction. These things were not available. They were not there for study. Only the barest fragments came down to the most educated people who were capable of availing themselves of libraries at a few universities or monasteries. It was gone. It was gone. And it sometimes stuff reemerged and then it submerged again because it fell out of vogue. And the point I'm making is that to find late 19th and early 20th century men and women, not to mention 21st century men and women, making references to ideas that are fairly close conceptually to things that the ancients were themselves considering, but without any necessarily familial line of transmission, is really, really remarkable. And it's a tonic to one's sense of the expansiveness of the human intellect and the capacity of the intellect to probe, to observe, to struggle for understanding. And those parallel insights abound. And when you find them, it's like a great light going on, and you're saying to yourself, wow, if people separated by such incredible circumstances, differences, conditions, languages, customs, cultures, religions are reaching parallel insights, there is a scent trail of something possibly eternal there and possibly true there. And so that is the eureka moment, I think, that meets you on the path, and that can be very exciting, and that I encourage people to probe when they encounter it.
And Mitch, would you have any kind of final words
appreciate
for seekers on the path? Oh, am I unmuted? Oh no.
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay, for like seekers on the path, or people who have had anomalous experiences, or people who are just looking into anomalous studies?
I would say the following. Be impeccable. Invest terrific sweat equity into what you're doing, and know your field really, really well. The astrologer should know something about astrology. The person studying Kabbalah should have some reasonable grasp of Hebrew language, at least in its phonetics, in its written form. The person who's invested in tarot or what have you should know something real about the history of tarot and its emergence in the early Renaissance, and the different forms and permutations it passed through until it came to be seen as an occult device later on. Just know your material really, really well. Dig a very, very deep well and drink from those waters. Make every effort you can to immerse yourself as deeply as possible in whatever it is that's your primary area of inquiry. And as we were discussing earlier, keep your standards really, really high in terms of who you collaborate with and who you debate with. The Italian novelist Ignazio Salone made a very simple statement that's worth living with. What is basic in life is the choice of one's comrades. What is basic in life is the choice of comrades. Set your standards high, and don't waste your time in trash talk on Twitter. Don't waste your time in threads that just extend into mathematical infinity and never go anywhere. You need that time. You need that time to make yourself more fully fortified in whatever it is you're studying. Set your standards really high, and the truth is, it helps everybody's inquiry. The more that we as a seeking community demonstrate impeccability, the more the right kinds of people are going to come to the search who want to do the same thing. And I must add a word of tribute to you guys, because the Anomalous Experience conference that I spoke at a few weeks ago was the very first time I had ever addressed a gathering that was chiefly focused on the UFO thesis. And the experience was so positive because the audience members and the speakers and the organizers and everyone involved were just so wonderful and so impeccable. And the points that were made from the podiums were challenging points. Nobody was playing to the crowd. This wasn't a greatest hits show. This wasn't a nostalgia fest. You know, this was people sharing the search with others in a way that I would have been proud to have my best friend there with me and say, look, you know, this is what we're trying to do here. This is what we're trying to accomplish here. You know, I would have been proud to have any intimate person with me there, so I could say, this is the neighborhood I'm hanging out in, you know, and it's a good neighborhood. And you guys have done so much with your conferences to create that space. So I have to offer that praise to you, and it comes from the heart.
Oh,
Thank
thanks so
you.
much.
It means a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that really means a lot coming from you, 'cause you're like a legend in your own field, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I got to take the garbage out and, you know, go back to life, you know.
Yeah,
So,
we all do.
Yeah, well, that's greatly appreciated. And we're going to have all the links in the description, but for people watching and listening, where could they find your work?
well, best place is on social media. I have a website that I'm really proud of, but I do a lousy job of keeping it updated, I'm afraid. I'm just busy with so much stuff, but I do keep things updated well on social media. Twitter at Mitch Horowitz, Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23. On certain places, you know, anywhere you buy your books, it's in digital, print, and audio.
And are there any upcoming projects or presentations or anything that people should be aware of that you're going to be attending?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, this coming Thursday night, let's see, I guess it's Thursday the 17th. I'm going to be speaking live at Film Noir Cinema in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, my home. And Film Noir Cinema is a wonderful, legendary art house cinema that has survived everything. And it's a nice, beautiful, intimate space. And this coming Thursday night, November 17th at 7 p.m., I'm going to be speaking there live. I'm giving a live, but digital, workshop on Hermeticism on Saturday, the 19th. So I'm looking forward to that. And all that stuff is on social media. It's on my link tree. Super easy to find.
All right,
Thank
great.
you so
And,
much.
you know, yeah, thank you so much, Mitch. And
Thank you.
we'll be seeing you and speaking to you again soon.
Look forward to
Absolutely.
it. Thank you all. Thank
I'll
you.
see you on Thursday.
Yeah. See you then. Okay.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.